Hi everybody, and today I want to talk about the Sapphires as an international Australian film and what we actually mean by international Australian cinema. Often when we're talking about international Australian films, we're either talking about films from outsiders representing Australia, so a film like Finding Nemo, which doesn't actually involve Australians in as the part of the creative team, or international crews and production companies actually coming to Australia and using Australia as shooting locations, or Australian films establishing co-production deals with people and companies and networks outside of Australia. But there's also another issue here, and that is the local films which don't have the co-production deals, but they're very much, at least in spirit and sentiment, international Australian films through the way that they're thinking of themselves as globalisation from within. And the Sapphires works really into this discussion because the Sapphire doesn't seem like an international Australian film. Officially it's not, but it very much is in what it's actually doing with its genre and what it's actually doing with its story and what it's actually doing with its ability to appeal to film goers and film demographics outside of Australia. So it's worth talking about that. The the paper I really want to talk about today is the Ben Goldsmith paper, which is outwardly looking Australian cinema and what that actually means. And really, in this lecture, I just want to talk through a number of quotes and really just think about those quotes, and we can sort of unpack them over this week and also the weeks to come. So the first quote is Ben Goldsmith. The outward-looking Australian international project asks what is atypical or shared and questions the function of cinema in articulating universal themes or common human values and concerns and fostering the sense of connection to people and places beyond them. So I think this is important. Often in the past when we've spoken about Australia and we've spoken about Australia as national cinema, we're always trying to discuss Australia as the other, as part of the other. So Australia is unlike other national cinemas, and it's always about what's different to Australia. But what Ben Goldsmith is saying in the international is actually thinking about what does Australia share with other countries. Now, that isn't in a way to denationalise Australian cinema, and I do want to talk about that in a little bit in the lecture. But this is essentially where the international is going. It's sort of saying, okay, here is an Australian story, an Australian idea, but what sort of global understanding does it have? And that's really important to this whole argument of understanding and defining an international Australian film. Another quote, productions that have cultural resonance, even if they do not fit official categories of Australianness. So this is very much, Ben Goldsmith's paper was written before the Sapphires, but it's very much a quote that sits very nicely and comfortably with a film like The Sapphires. The Sapphires has a cultural resonance, and again, that word resonance appears. It was there last week with Elizabeth Avram talking about Finding Nemo, and here it is again, the cultural resonance. And we certainly had a cultural resonance with The Sapphires when it came out, and I think we still do have a cultural resonance with this film, even if it does not fit official categories of Australianness. Now, The Sapphires is interesting because it does fit categories of Australianness through its Indigenous Australianness, but not this category of the musical. The musical is historically and traditionally been tied to Hollywood. Now, Adrian Martin has written on the Australian musical, if there is such a thing, and Therese Davis fleshes this out in her paper on the Sapphires, so please read that paper, which is a recommended reading for this week, which is really interesting. Because what's actually happening with the Sapphires is it's finding a cultural resonance with Australian audiences through the musical. And it's actually saying that, hey, Australians make musicals, Hollywood make musicals, other countries make musicals, and that is sort of an international connection that we all have to this genre. And that is a way of actually thinking about, say, a film like The Sapphires on an international way. And certainly its key creative crew were thinking about The Sapphires as a musical. When this film came out, a film that came out previously was a film called Dreamgirls, and there is a clear connection between both films. Now, I don't think in a derivative sort of way. I actually think in quite an interesting sort of way through what they're both actually doing with girl groups and the musical genre. So there's a difference in terms here. There's sort of three terms. We're talking about national cinema. We're talking about national cinema. National cinema is very much about what's happening in the national, and it's about the national being different to other countries. And there is the international. The international is very much about we're all kind of part of the same filmmaking network, and we're all sort of making similar films. So it's actually about leaving Australia's national otherness behind for an international connection. Then there's supranational, and I think that's really, really important to the Sapphires, understanding the Sapphires, and just understanding this course more in general. What the supranational is really about is thinking about Australia on national terms, but how those national terms actually speak and tap and have a resonance on a sort of a global context. So it's not actually about um, discarding the national and the national importance and the national representation. It's actually thinking about that national through an international way. So what the Sapphires is doing is actually saying, well, we've kind of got this indigenous thing going on here, and every country has this indigenous thing. So the sort of the soul music is this connection between Indigenous Australians and Black Americans, which is so it sort of meets up in Vietnam in those scenes in Vietnam in this film, which is really interesting. Another quote. This was from Tom O'Regan and Potter in 2003, who they wrote a kind of a follow-up piece to Ben Goldsmith, Outwardly Looking Australian Cinema. I've put this on Blackboard as I think, further reading for you. Have a read of it. It's really interesting. I mean, anyone who sort of says that Ben Goldsmith's piece is sort of was written in a moment and it doesn't actually hold anymore, I actually think Tom O'Regan and Potter make it clear that this is actually an ongoing thing, and the international Australian cinema is not a sort of a flash in the pan. It's actually something that's always been part of Australian cinema, and it's certainly part of Australian screen policy right now. And here is their quote: alongside born international production, so-called runaway production, we need to include the transformations within the national production space in terms of formats, processes, structural connections, production companies, and TV network operations. These are likewise not evidently global because they are happening at the national scale and do not need to be run through international agreements. That is, again, is another quote which you could tie directly to the Sapphires. So when you're thinking about the Sapphires as an international film, right, it's global in its own vision and its own look. It's not global because of a co-production. And I think that's really important. It is a film that is happening at the national scale. And it's not, in a way, it's not evidently global. It's an Indigenous film, which have historically been considered as very national in their vision and their look and their design. But here is a film that is very much attaching itself to the musical genre, and it's doing it on its own terms. And that's why I think the Sapphires is actually quite clever and smart in what it's doing. And it doesn't actually, there's not that cop out at the ending of the film. And I'll talk about the ending in a couple of minutes. Another quote from Reagan and Potter: globalisation is in local production and international production alike. It is happening from within and from without. Right? Again, The Sapphires is a film that comes to mind. It is across high budget and low budget programs and films, and it is both quality and demonic entertainment. So it's kind of there in all sorts of films. It's not just like, I mean, the argument is with Ben Goldsmith's paper, and Therese Davis sort of makes this argument in her own paper on The Sapphires, is that all that Goldsmith is looking at is the big budget co-productions really between Hollywood and Australia. And what O'Regan's saying, and Potter is saying, and what Therese Davis is saying is that it's actually happening all over the industry. It's not just international co-productions with America and Australia. It's actually also in these smaller films, these smaller budget films, and a film like The Sapphires. I mean, The Sapphires wasn't made on chicken feed. It was actually, it's a decent budget and a decent cast, and it's sort of a mid-range Australian film, but it very much is really happening, from within and from without as an Australian film. It's a film that is about globalisation and thinking of itself on global terms. And I think that's really important to not just look at one type of film that could be classed as an international Australian film, but to look at all different sorts of Australian films that are being made and how they all have an international vision and design and idea and sentiment, really. So this is Therese Davis' quote from her: "Transnational studies of Australian film have tended to focus on large-scale, mainstream, international production arrangements and economic benefits to the nation, with little attention paid to textual or social issues such as on-screen cultural representation." And that is really interesting. That is kind of her dig at Goldsmith International Australian Thesis. She's saying that the focus has been too much on the bigger films and not the smaller films, and she sort of makes the argument that, hey, hang on, let's actually look at a film like The Sapphires and just apply that to Goldsmith's argument and just see if it does hold. So how is international represented in national films? So that's really what Therese Davis is interested in, and it's also what I'm interested in this week, but the following weeks to come, and also certainly The Sapphires. How is international represented in the national film? And The Sapphires is such a fascinating example for that. So denationalisation, and what does that actually mean? And it's a very ugly word. And Tom O'Regan and Potter use it. And I must say, this is what I don't agree with their paper. And this is sort of how they set it up. Different national element, whether production companies, local format production, and policy settings that are still identified as localised in national settings, are now substantially oriented towards global agendas and systems. This is leading to a subtle process of denationalisation. So that's actually stripping away the unique and the important things, the identifiable things of Australia. Now, often when we think of globalisation and crossover, it's discussed through a denationalisation, right? But The Sapphires brings the international musical genre into the national. I don't think The Sapphires ever denationalises itself. And I couldn't actually give you one example of that in the film. I think it very much remains true to the Indigenous film. It remains true to the international genre of the musical as well. And I think it's because it doesn't actually have these co-production ties where there's nothing forced in the film. It actually does it all sort of on its own terms. Now the ending is really interesting. Okay, so what you have is Julie, and she doesn't leave to make it in Hollywood. This is her dream, to leave it to make it in Hollywood. And it doesn't actually happen. Now, Adrian Martin, when he was reviewing the film, and Therese Davis does sort of unpack Adrian Martin's review in her own paper, he says it turns its back on globalised show business to actually go back to Australia. But what I would argue is I'd argue something a bit different. It doesn't turn its back on globalisation. It does it on its own terms. It doesn't become a fairy tale. It doesn't become the film you expect it to be. Now, if it was to do that, to actually go to Hollywood and to make it big in Hollywood, then you could actually say O'Regan's comment does hold for this film anyway. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't actually denationalise itself. It actually remains very national, and it does what a lot of Indigenous films do, and it goes back to the community. It goes back to the Indigenous community, and that's where it begins and that's where it ends. And that's why The Sapphires is really interesting and actually does react directly against O'Regan and Potter, who are talking about this denationalisation of international Australian films. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's actually true, and they don't really come up with solid examples from their paper of films that actually do that. So talking about denationalisation, you want an example of Sapphire's denationalisation. Here it is in the promotional posters. Now, the poster on the left is the international US poster of sort of foregrounding Chris O'Dowd and as sort of the star of the film. If you've seen the film, and as you will see the film, he really isn't the star at all. He's important, he's sort of central to the film, but it's really not his film at all. And then what you have is the Sapphires kind of pushed into the background. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the Australian poster where you've got basically the Sapphires sort of a front and centre, and Chris O'Dowd is certainly in the poster, but he's more in the background. And if you look at the international poster, what it's actually doing, it is denationalising what is actually going on in this film, which is it's the story of this Indigenous, true story, this Indigenous all-girl singing group who went to Vietnam. And it's kind of interesting that if you actually look at that poster, the international poster, it just seems like any other poster of any other contemporary musical. Where if you look at the Australian poster, it is doing something a bit different. Now, the tagline of the Australian poster is "Follow your heart, discover your soul," a connection there to soul music. And in the international poster, I mean, it's really pushing the whole idea of it's a true story and the whole celebrity of Chris O'Dowd. Now, talking about this promotion and what's going on with this promotion and whether it actually was correct to do that to Chris O'Dowd and actually push the Sapphires into the background. Now, Carl Quinn in the Sydney Morning Herald said this: "It's smart marketing, the best way to get the Sapphires in front of as many pairs of American eyes as possible by foregrounding Chris O'Dowd." But Nunman on Bitch Media, which is a great title, said this, and I think this is the correct assessment, really. "There comes a time when smart marketing taints the nuance of the production that it seeks to promote." And what happened is the poster, the Chris O'Dowd sort of foregrounded poster, the international poster, caused so much controversy to the film. It actually hurt the film. It hurt its box office, and it hurt actually. I mean, because here is a film that's being promoted, and the key creatives are actually having to stand up and sort of claim why they would have endorsed that sort of poster. And it became very, very hurtful to the film in general. But when we're thinking about international Australian films, I do want to look at promotional posters and trailers across the course and across the following weeks, because they are really interesting when you take an Australian film and how do you actually sell that to an international audience. And I guess what Carl Quinn is actually saying is, how do you take these sort of unknown Australian actresses and singers and actually use that as a marketing ploy to American audiences? It's going to be very, very difficult to do. But I actually think it's not a true or fair assessment of actually what's going on in the film, and it was a real mistake and a real misfire, where people were accusing the posters of A, racism, and B, sexism. So just to conclude, just a couple more quotes from Ben Goldsmith. "My intention has been to encourage scholars of Australian cinema to consider the diversity of relations that constitute it, and not to be limited to understanding of Australian cinema that simply conform with categories developed by government agencies for their own purposes." So this is thinking about Australian cinema beyond just a sort of a tight definition of what a national film is. It's actually describing what's going on in a number of films, not giving a prescriptive idea of what an Australian film has to be. It's actually thinking of all the different sorts of films that are happening inside and sort of outside Australia with Australia connections, and just sort of describing what's going on in each of them. And because the definitions or the descriptions are going to be so different, what we're actually understanding is just how wide and diverse and complex Australian cinema actually is. And that's what Goldsmith is really on about. He's wanting to complicate the idea of what an Australian film is. He doesn't want to give you a nice, neat, tidy answer. And just finally, rather than understanding Australian cinema as a territory, Australian international cinema is conceived as a space of relations. And I want to think about that going into the Sapphires, a space of relations, what's actually going on with these spatial relations. Now, you've got spatial relations through sort of like the international Indigenous film, if you want to call it that. You've got spatial relations through the genre of the musical and what it's actually doing with that. But then the Sapphire is really interesting because here is another film that actually takes place in Australia, and it also takes place outside of Australia. And that's a theme of a lot of films that we're looking at over this course. The film that this really shares a lot of comparison to is actually a film called Ballabo, which we are seeing, I think, in week 4 or 5, which is by Robert Connolly, which again is another film. Some of it's set in Australia, some of it's set outside of Australia, and also in Asia, which is sort of interesting, with all the push going into Asia, which we'll be picking up next week. Okay, that's my spiel on the Sapphires. I hope you got something out of it, and I look forward to chatting further.